Now you should have it.
Yes, the seeing it. Beautiful.
Okay.
Fantastic. Okay, so let me start the introduction. So, Dr. Stephen Bryen is author, writer, speaker. Is a defense expert with 50 years of experience in government and industry. He's a former Deputy Undersecretary for Defense for Trade Secretary Policy, Security Policy. Yeah, I know this is a bit long. It's on the website, but because this is a rare, it's a great opportunity, so we would like to learn a little bit more, uh, from Dr. Bryan. So he has served as the senior staff director of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as the executive director of a grassroots political organization, also as the head of the Jewish Institute of National Security Affairs, and also as the Deputy Under Secretary of Defense for Trade Security Policy, and also the founder of the first director of the Defense Technology Security Administration, and also the president of Delta Tech Incorporated, and also the president of Nika North America, and as the commissioner of the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. Currently, Dr. Bryan is the senior fellow at the American Center for Democracy, and also on the board of directors of Il Nodo di Cordio. He writes directly for Asia Times. The author, he's published his technology policy and strategy blog. His blog is www.bryansblog.com. It's a popular website for decision makers in government, military, and industry. He has published 5 books. The latest is Volume 3 of Essays in Technology, Security, and Strategy, and a book on security for religious organization called Security for Holy Places, published by Morgan James Publishing. His writing has earned praise worldwide. His extensive experience and high effectiveness has earned him the highest civilian award of the U.S. Defense Department on 2 occasions and established him as a proven government, civic, and business leader in Washington, D.C. and internationally. Morley Safer of the CBS program 60 Minutes said Dr. Bryan was the Pentagon's top cop, the man whose job it was to ensure that sensitive technology would be kept from enemies, potential enemies, and questionable allies. Lynn Shannon of Time magazine said Steve Bryan is the Yoda of arms trade. Formerly the Defense Department's export czar, he knows every sinkhole in the regulatory swamp. Ignore him at your peril. The late U.S. Senator John Hines said, I agree with Stephen Bryan about the need to keep asking our allies to do more. Dr. Bryan came to private industry after a career in government, but even there, he was an innovator and entrepreneur. A key part of Dr. Bryan's portfolio was managing and shepherding U.S. Allied Technology Corporation in pursuit of the common defense. It's by David Silberg in Homeland Security magazine, and now HS Today. Talking about Stuxnet, Dr. Bryan said Wired article make it clear that Stuxnet was designed to kill Iran's centrifuge. I frankly don't understand how it can be described by Wired as the most menacing malware in history. It seems to me maybe it was the best malware in history. Hub Crosney in the chapter Man of Pentagon, Deadly Business 4 Walls, 8 Windows, wrote, surprisingly to some, the Reagan administration attacked a select few of the best and the brightest to its ranks to help control sensitive exports. Among them, Dr. Stephen Bryan. In Common Defense Quarterly, Dr. Bryan said the first technology transfer recorded where iron making was passed from the Philistine to King David had consequences just as the transfer of supercomputing technology to China has consequences today. Dr. Stephen Bryan is the author of the 3-volume collection, Writings, Essays in Technology, Security, and Strategy. In reviewing the book, noted author and terrorism expert Rachel Ehrfeld said these interesting, colorful, and engaging essays demonstrate deep understanding of what led to exacerbate the technological foreign policy and the national security challenges facing America today. Dr. Stephen Bryan major study is technology security and national power, winners and losers. That work covers key strategic and defense issues ranging from technology transfers to proliferation to weapon procurement. As Dr. Bryen wrote in Focus magazine, as NATO has come wider, it has become shallower and less able to meet its own standards for the defense of its members. And the weak NATO may in fact be worse than no NATO at all. Dr. Stephen Bryen was twice awarded the Defense Department's highest civilian honor, the Distinguished Service Medal. So it's truly, our distinguished guest today, and it's our great pleasure honor. So welcome, Dr. Stephen Bryen.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in your program. I have a fondness for the aerospace industry. For 10 years, I headed Finmechanic in North America. Now it's called the Leonardo, where a good part of our business was aircraft, missiles, even some space satellites. So it was an exciting period in my life in those 10 years. And I think I was able to accomplish even more than I thought I would be able to accomplish. But I also enjoyed very much working with my industrial partners, and Finmechanica and now Leonardo had many of them, Lockheed, Northrop, General Dynamics, the list is as long as your arm. So today I'm going to talk about Taiwan and what might be the right defense strategy for that country. And I call it a country, not an island. As you all know, it's around 28 million people. It is claimed by China. China does have a historical claim, but it's clear that the thrust of opinion in Taiwan is a desire to remain both independent and democratic. Because, first of all, and before I get to the actual details, Taiwan earned its democracy. It wasn't just something that it acquired. It was from 1949 until the 1970s, very much under a military regime, and in fact under martial law. Some of my friends in Taiwan, and I'm very proud of what they did, fought that and fought the continuation of martial law, and they very much wanted to turn the country into a democratic state, and they succeeded. And today it's a scintillating, a brilliant democratic country. I've had the honor of attending as an observer one of the presidential elections, not the current one, but the previous one, in Taiwan, talking to all the candidates, talking to people, visiting voting booths. I wish that our elections here were as honest and straightforward as what I saw in Taiwan. So it was really quite something. And I think it would be a great tragedy for the world and for the hope of the world if Taiwan fell under the control of the Communist Party and of China. So with that said, let me say at the outset that we know very well that China threatens to take Taiwan by force. They've made this abundantly clear. They're flying on a daily basis now very aggressive missions around Taiwan and around some of the surrounding islands. These include warplanes of the latest models, surveillance aircraft. They've also, along with those airborne exercises, are carrying out naval exercises. And as you know, they've also been carrying out missile tests as a way to try and intimidate people in Taiwan. I was in Taiwan in 1996 when ostensibly there was a missile testing program of China that closed down the Taiwan Strait. And it was followed, or in parallel actually, a beginning of an organization that looked like it could be a ground assault on Taiwan itself, using naval ships to bring ground troops over to Taiwan to attack the island. That was an imminent threat. It took two weeks, really. And I was there with Jim Woolsey, who had been prior to that served as a CIA director. And Admiral Bud Edney, who's quite famous in the U.S. Navy as a submariner, a leading submariner and decision maker. And we were there to visit with the Taiwanese government, including the legislative yuan and the president and everybody in the military. And it was a very frightening time. And we were on our phones calling back to Washington saying, you have to come in here. You have to do something because this could be a disaster. So finally, they did respond. But it was a long time coming. Although once Washington did respond, China backed off. And so there was no invasion of Taiwan, and there were no missiles fired at Taiwan. And the crisis passed. Today, we're sitting on that same powder keg. And so I start my discussion with that. And this photo that you can see on your screen was a kind of a secret photo showing a war room in China with a mock-up of part of the Taiwan that these guys are practicing war against. Now, we all know that China has a massive amount of missiles, rockets, missiles. Their navy is far superior to the Taiwanese navy, which is quite small. Just to name one point, they have nuclear and diesel electric conventional submarines, some now with AIP, with the ability to stay underwater for a very long time, thanks to hydrogen power packs. That's called AIP, means air independent propulsion. Taiwan has exactly 4 submarines. Two of them are old World War II or post World War II Guppy 2 submarines, which are of no combat use. And then there are 2 other Dutch submarines made in the 1980s, one of which is now in overhaul. It has to be overhauled. So they actually have 1 operational submarine. This means in practice they have none at all. Now, as far as Air Force is concerned, if you just talk about numbers, let's just talk about numbers. China is dominant and Taiwan is not. It's that simple. You talk about numbers of missiles, numbers of aircraft, types of aircraft, the whole 9 yards. Taiwan is very restricted. Now, the US policy was supposed over the last few decades, I actually have it as 1, but it's longer than that. It's mostly like 2 or 3 decades, was supposed to give Taiwan a capability to be sufficient to balance any threat from China, so that if the Chinese decided to attack Taiwan, the Taiwanese would have a reasonable chance of at least stalemating, if not defeating the attackers. That has never been fulfilled. The last time Taiwan got new aircraft from the United States and actually arrived there, and I'll explain more later, was when George Herman Walker Bush, 1991, at the end of his term, authorized the sale of F-16. These were the early AB models, F-16s to Taiwan. We'll come back to that in a little while. China, on the other hand, has very advanced aircraft. The J-20, its newest operational aircraft, is regarded as a possible 5th generation multi-role fighter and stealthy aircraft. You can see a photo of its bomb bay opened up on the screen. It carries its stores internally and then pops them out to the side where they're released. So, at least in theory, the J-20 is an operational stealth aircraft. I have reason to believe it's not as good as advertised, but we can. Right now, when you don't know, you don't know. So you have to plan that it works, that it functions. Now, it has a lot of missiles. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples which are regarded as very significant. The DF-26 is a medium-range ballistic missile, which is capable. It's capable of hitting Guam, and as you probably know, we have a very important naval and air base on Guam, and that's where we stage our large B-1, B-2, and B-52 bombers. It was from Guam, and it's also where we stage aircraft carriers other than in Japan. What makes the DF-26 significant are two things. One, it can be either a nuclear or a conventional missile, depends on how it's set up. And secondly, and more importantly, I think it's very accurate, or at least it's claimed to be very accurate. And that makes it a formidable threat. You can see one of the DF-26 bases in China that is operational. And then the one that has caught the most public attention is called the DF-21D. And the Chinese call, and I want to emphasize that, the Chinese call this the carrier killer. And this is an anti-ship ballistic missile with a range of around 1,450 kilometers, or about 900 miles. It's a considerable range. And there's some talk that it's even been expanded beyond that range. Now, why is this so significant? What China's been trying to do is to push back the American aircraft carriers as far as possible, so that the range of the aircraft they can launch can't really help deal with a crisis in a place like Taiwan or even in Japan, because the carriers will be too far away to play a role. And if the DF-21 is as good as advertised, again, we only know what's written in public. We don't have any secret information. I don't even want any secret information, honestly. But if it's as good as advertised, this is a serious issue, because then in order to use our aircraft carriers, we have to be able to do two things. We have to be able to knock out the DF-21 missiles that may be fired at our ships, and we have to be able to take out the launch sites of these missiles so that they're not a threat. It's a big challenge. But it also says that in any conflict where we want to bring in the carriers, we have to be able to do those two things, where we cannot use the aircraft carriers. And as you may or may not know, there's a big debate in Washington, in fact, no more than in Washington, but around the country, on the utility of aircraft carriers today, given the fact of their potential vulnerability. And I don't think we know the answer to that, but it's certainly a concern. Remember that an aircraft carrier not only holds over 100 fighter planes, which is quite a considerable number, but it also has 5,000 sailors and some contractors. So you guys that are contractors, keep that in mind. And then China is also moving into the hypersonic field. They actually, if the reports that we hear and the demonstrations which they claim to have made are all correct, they are very close to fielding various kinds of hypersonic weapons, including the one you see on the screen, the DF-17, which is a hypersonic glide vehicle. This is nearly a strategic weapon. Whether it really functions or not, we don't know for sure. But we are going to see all the major navies in the world, the US, the Russian, the Chinese, and maybe some of our European partners with hypersonic type weapons in future, because hypersonic weapons can get past most of the known defenses against missiles that exist in the world today, whether it's a Patriot in the US, the S-400 in Russia, the Chinese equivalent of the S-400, or the Israeli Arrow 3. I mean, all these missile systems which could try to take down a threat are threatened by hypersonic vehicles. China is in the lead in some ways in this field. Now, just a quick look at some geography. I think geography is very important. Taiwan is preciously close, as you can see, to China, and essentially sits opposite of Fujian province. Is a very big province there, where the Chinese have put together quite a significant military capability facing Taiwan. So if there's an invasion, it's likely to come, I can't I can point, I think, with my mouse. Can you do it with my mouse? Yeah, it's likely to come probably from around this area, either directly onto Taiwan. Whoop, I came back too fast. Either directly onto Taiwan. It's not liking me. Or it's going to come and hit one of the Taiwanese islands, either perhaps Penghu, which has an air base, which is a very important base for Taiwan. Or I've written about this in the Asia Times, Kinmen. Kinmen you may know as Quemoy. And if you remember back in 1960, in the famous debate between Kennedy on the one hand and Nixon on the other, the argument was about the feasibility of defending Quemoy and Matsu. And it's very difficult to defend them. Quemoy is actually located right up against China, less than a mile and a half from the Chinese mainland. So it's quite vulnerable. Now, I mentioned Penghu. This is a photo, a recent photo of one of the Taiwanese aircraft. This happens to be the FCK-1 indigenous or home-built jet fighter that the Taiwanese have in the background. And in the foreground is a new cruise missile that the Taiwanese defense industry has developed that can be carried by the FCK-1. The FCK-1, there's I think about 100 of them in service. I may be a little high. Is a home-built jet fighter, an evolution, if you want, of the F-5. It's quite a capable machine, but quite short-legged. And it has, it's a kind of early fourth generation machine, basically. But it is supersonic. It has a pretty good radar, and it's capable of carrying both air-to-air, of course, and air-to-sea missiles and air-to-land. And a cruise missile doesn't care. It'll go after a naval target or a land target. I believe that the Taiwanese developed this to go after the new Chinese aircraft carriers, which are now making their appearance. There are now 2 of them operational on the Chinese side and 2 more in construction. And the biggest problem China has is not the carriers per se, but it's the lack of proper aircraft for the carriers. I mentioned Kinmen. This is the actual part of the Kinmen Island. There's more than one island, but this is the big one. And I visited Kinmen 3 times over the years. In 1949, there was a major battle there called Guningtao. This battle was an attack by China to try and take Kinmen as a prelude to invading Taiwan. It wasn't a very big scale invasion, but it was substantial enough because Kinmen itself was lightly defended. But interestingly, after 3 days, the invasion failed, and the Taiwanese were able to push back the Chinese invasion force. And at that point, Mao decided that not a good idea to attack Taiwan. So they backed off. There had been preceding that artillery exchanges and other things. And those things continued from the 1949 all the way up to 1960, which is why Nixon and Kennedy were debating the issue even then. Now, a lot of Kinmen, by the way, is underground, remarkably underground. Whether this kind of underground system is capable of protecting the island and providing for a defense, I don't know. It can sure take a pounding, of course, before it's subdued. But this happens to be, you're seeing a picture of a large theater, which can also be used as a command center. Even the city hospital of Kinmen, and it's quite a nice hospital, is entirely underground. So it's quite formidable from that point of view. I think largely these kinds of defenses are out of date, but it's worth knowing about. Now, the great question, the big thing that we all want to know is, will the United States come to Taiwan's aid? I go back to the point in '96 when I was there with Woolsey and others, that we were very worried about whether the U.S. would come to the aid of Taiwan, and it took a long time before it happened. We have substantial bases, naval and air bases, in Japan, nearby, certainly within range of Taiwan, and of course on Okinawa, which is down the bottom of your screen, and there's two red dots where you see Kadena and Futenma Air Base. We have modern aircraft there, which includes F-18s, F-15s, and F-35s now. So we have the firepower to defend Taiwan for sure. And I want to make that very clear. There's no reason why, if China for some reason tried to attack Taiwan, that the US aircraft could intervene. They can intervene. And my belief is they would be very successful. There are other issues that arise, and we'll come to those in a bit. Now, China has been working on what's called an anti-access area denial approach to sealing off its power along what's called the first island chain. You can see that marked on the map down here. And Taiwan sits right in the center of the first island chain. It's the single biggest impediment to Chinese control of all the sea space from Japan all the way down past the South China Sea. And their objective is to control all that. Meanwhile, we have important choke points. We, the United States, have important choke points, which the Chinese are surely aware of. One of them, and most important one, Okinawa. And so the Chinese have to have freedom of action to move out from those places. And I believe their entire program, their military program, is aimed at getting control sufficiently of the first island chain to then push the United States back as much as possible, maybe past the second island chain, which you can see out here, flowing all the way up here, all the way out to Guam over here, or even further. And it's not on this map, but all the way back to Hawaii. So if they could do it, that would be their long-term goal. The short-term goal, and the one that we're concerned with now, is the first island chain with Taiwan in the middle. And one of the, it's not just that they're so anxious to take 28 million people from Taiwan back into China who will be hostile, who will be democratic, and who will be damn difficult. That's not their goal. Their goal is to push back the United States. That's their goal. That's the real goal. And therefore leverage the Japanese over here, Koreans as well over here, and essentially dominate the entire region. The rest of them in the region, Vietnam, which is worried about the Chinese, and the Philippines, who are worried. Well, some days they're worried, some days they could care less. Those guys don't really play much of a serious defense role in the equation. The big equation is the US first, number one. Taiwan, I would put number two. And number three, I would put Japan, even though Japan has a large air force and a pretty good Navy, and especially a really good, if small, submarine force. But whether the Japanese will fight is going to be one of the great questions of our time. This is a picture of Andersen Air Base on Guam. And you can see a B-1 taking off. It's a very formidable aircraft. The B-1 is not a stealthy bomber, but it carries standoff missiles, so it can do things that even a stealth bomber may not be able to do as well. It can carry a big load. B-52 can carry an even bigger load. Neither stealth, neither one. B-2, which is a wonderful stealthy aircraft, doesn't have the load to do as much damage. So the big question, will Japan let American planes, US planes, launch to defend Taiwan? I think it's a very serious question. And it doesn't get much airtime these days. People don't think about it too much. I mean, they assume, well, Japan's an ally. U.S. has a defense treaty with Japan. The Japanese self-defense force itself is quite small, although their air force is pretty decent. But there's no actual agreement between the U.S. and Japan that we know about, no public agreement that gives the U.S. freedom of action in a crisis scenario. Now, in the past, whether it was Vietnam or Korea, the Japanese have been very positive and helpful and allowed us to operate from Taiwan, but not in a direct combat role, but in a support role. We provided supplies from Japan to Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict. Similarly, before that, in Korea, when that was necessary, we do all kinds of joint exercises with the Japanese and the Koreans, for that matter. Been controversial in Korea because of the theoretical rapprochement with North Korea, and the North Koreans have complained a lot about it. But in a direct combat role where we would use Japanese airfields, whether on Okinawa or on the main islands, and we have a number of those bases I showed you on the map, it isn't clear that we would have freedom of action. And there's some indications that are negative. First one, it's less visible to us here, but it's very visible to the Japanese, is they're constantly under pressure from China. The Chinese put the arm on the Japanese anytime they want to do something. And one of the things they wanted to do, which have now canceled, is build a missile defense system based on what's called Aegis onshore. The Aegis missile system is a naval missile system that now, with the SM-3 missiles, is quite an effective, or regarded as quite as an effective system. But Aegis onshore is a 24/7 defense system. It would be equivalent maybe to THAAD, which we have in Korea. And it was very important for Japan to have this system because it could protect air bases in Japan and naval bases. Yokosuka, for example, all these bases could be protected against the Chinese missile attack to some degree, maybe not perfect, but certainly very important. If you go Aegis on the naval combatant, it's only as good as the time you can keep it at sea and operating at sea. You can't do it 24/7. Doesn't work that way. And it's very weather restricted. Bad weather, those ships have to come in or go to safe harbor, but they can't operate as a missile defense system. Nor do they have quite the positioning that you can get from an Aegis onshore system. Japan was supposed to buy that system, but at the last minute and just before the administration has changed in Japan a few months ago, the Japanese canceled their participation and the procurement of that system, the Aegis onshore. Ostensibly, they canceled it because there were local complaints. Well, if the missiles are launched and they fall down on our houses, that's very bad. So we don't want them to fall down on our houses. These were some of the excuses. You can go in chapter and verse on the excuses. All of it's nonsense. Because the fact of the matter is that if you launch a missile from Aegis offshore, from Aegis at sea, against an intruder that's coming this way, the missiles are going to fall on your territory anyway. So it makes no difference, frankly. So I think that was a false issue. The second issue that the Japanese raised was about the cost of the system, saying it was become much, much, much more expensive. I don't doubt that. But Japan has much, much, much more money to spend than they're letting on. So I don't think that's a real excuse. No, I think it was a real setback, and a lot of it was because of Chinese pressure. Today, the Japanese air defenses just can't protect from missile attack. They have a Patriot system, but not enough of them to cover the islands. Certainly nothing for Okinawa. But the real point is the Patriot is not a current generation air defense system. It's a system that has been progressively modernized and upgraded. It's certainly not bad, But I think you can see from the evidence we have, for example, missile attacks on Saudi Arabia, where the Patriot was able to hit some missiles in the final phase of their descent into the target, but because the kinetic energy was so great, and anyway, the warhead has separated from the missile body, the damage was done. Now, again, U.S. aircraft carriers will and certainly should play a role depending on whether we can defeat those Chinese missiles. But Japan is a major base for our carriers, and we need it for logistical support. What had happened in the crisis, would they allow our aircraft carriers to come and go, to reprovision, to do all the things they will need to do to fight a war? I don't know. And then finally, what about Japan's Air Force? They now have F-35s. They're getting more. They're terrific airplanes, but will they fight? Will the Japanese government permit them? This is, I think, the major unanswered question of today. And then the next one that goes with it is, how long can Taiwan fight? The old idea was that Taiwan could hold off the Chinese for a few weeks, allowing time for the U.S. to bring its defenses into play. Well, I got news for you. That as a tactical or a strategic idea, and it's a little bit of both, is bad news. It doesn't make sense. Not today. Not with missiles, and not with the swarms of fighter aircraft, and not with the potential of swarms of ships bringing combat soldiers onto Taiwan Island. That scenario that really is a bad one. And even more to the point, Taiwanese airfields today, and there are a number of them, military and civilian, are increasingly vulnerable to missile attacks and being taken out of action. Is that important? Yeah, you better bet it is. We've seen what happened in Iraq when one of our bases, which had an airfield, was attacked. Aircraft were damaged. The runway was damaged. We saw it in Syria. It's a huge problem, especially now in the age of precision weapons. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, weapons weren't nearly as precise as they've become. So we can't expect, and I think any scenario would show that we have to get into conflict right away to help Taiwan, or the fight is almost over. And I think I've gone through this slide, so I'm going to skip ahead, except to mention one thing. One of the great questions is the last bullet. Does Washington have the political will to get into the fight to save Taiwan? I'm leaving that as an open question. But I think part of the difficulty in 1996, in fact, I know that part of the difficulty in 1996 was the huge reluctance of Washington to commit itself at all to defending Taiwan. Now, Congress is a great supporter of Taiwan, but not necessarily an administration, and depends on which administration. Before I go on, I want to tell you that I prepared this presentation well before the presidential election. I don't think I would change a single word of it, just to make that note clear. Now, the Pentagon has its own concerns, and I want to talk a little bit about them. First of all, right now, the Pentagon wants to avoid any fight with China if it can. That's because we've only pivoted to Asia, so to speak, in the past few years. Look, during the Obama administration, the official assessment of China's power was that China was 20 years behind the United States and therefore not a threat. That assessment is no longer the assessment of the Pentagon. The assessment of the Pentagon today, based on war games and simulations, is that the Chinese are very powerful and a big problem, especially in their own area, along that first island chain. Maybe not, outside of the range of their aircraft and missiles. Certainly not in the Middle East or in the Atlantic or in the South Pacific. But when you get to that first island chain, they have dominant power. Worries the Pentagon a great deal. Secondly, our defenses in Asia, our air defenses, our naval systems, even our aircraft are still in the process of modernization, reinforcement, introduction of new weapons like hypersonic weapons, like long-range precision missiles, like ability to hit Chinese aircraft before they see us. These are things we're working on. Some are partly implemented, but we've got a long way to go. Thirdly, I've already mentioned the Japan, but we have problems with our other allies in the area too, not the least of which is Korea, which has a very formidable army that has fought side by side with the United States in Korea and in Vietnam in the past. Great fighters, but we have a left-wing regime in Korea today, the Moon government, his family comes from North Korea, who's inclined to not like the American presence in Korea, would like to see it reduced, would like to see it even eliminated if he could get away with that politically. So Korea is another variable and a problematic one. And the others I mentioned, the only solid ally we have is all the way down in Australia. And that's a really great ally, but it's very, very far away from where this problem exists. And there's also a worry, it's not spoken about, but it's there, that politically Japan may force us to remove ourselves from the Japanese territory. That's not an immediate thing because Japan has lived off the fact since the end of the Second World War, Japan's defense has been bought and paid for by the United States, which is why Japan has such a paltry defense budget, running at about 1.2% of GNP, among the lowest in the world. They're not paying for their defense, we're paying for it. But that could change, and there's ruminations and feeling in the Japanese political mind that maybe the time has come because maybe China's now more powerful. Maybe the US isn't going to give us the free ride anymore, so maybe we don't want to tie ourselves to the United States. So this is a definite political theme that we'll see develops more and more in the future. And then, of course, there are divisions inside the US government, which I already alluded to with the Pentagon, but the State Department has been pro-China for many, many years. And while there is a faction in the State Department that likes Taiwan, mostly they like China. They like to be on a peaceful trade basis and a peaceful political basis with China, not to offend the Chinese. Let's work diplomatically. Let's not do those tours through the Taiwan Straits or those tours through the South China Sea. Let's call that stuff off. Let's cool it and let's do diplomacy. And remember that since you guys are all on the West Coast, China has powerful friends in America and the United States, especially on the West Coast, because the high-tech industry of California is doing much of its manufacturing in China and it's much of its partnering in China. And like many companies in the United States, looking for business in China. It's a market, a big market, 1 billion plus people. We don't want to throw that away. So there's a great deal of concern that a hostile US-China situation is going to deny us markets, hurt our businesses, and lead to nothing good. Finally, there's a concern that rescuing Taiwan could lead to a long war with China, a painful war, an expensive war that would bankrupt us, maybe bankrupt the Chinese, but achieve no good, lead to a worldwide depression, for example. And then last but not least, and this is administrations in the past, including the State Department, of course, but also the National Security Council, push the Taiwanese to negotiate a deal with China, avoid conflict. Let's work out something. What the fly in the ointment on that theme is the fact of what happened to Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was a theoretical example of a successful transition of power from the British to China allowing Hong Kong to somehow come out of it, retaining its democratic nature, its free politics, and allowing the people of Hong Kong to act differently than the people of China. Everyone said this is wonderful. Taiwan should do the same thing. But what happened? Chinese cracked down on Hong Kong, big time, and you're still going on. There were a number of refugees who came out of Hong Kong, escaped the Chinese police, and wound up in Taiwan. But most of all, it's told the Taiwanese public and the Taiwanese leaders that any deal with China is a bad deal because it's going to lead to a crackdown, and we'll lose our rights, we'll lose our freedom, we'll lose our independence, and we'll get nothing for it except trouble. So we come to another question, which is I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll just go through this very quickly.
Don't worry, your time's 1.5 hours, so at least 2:40 if needed. It can be extended if you need.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
All right, great. So if the U.S. commits forces, and let's ask the question, what happens? There are different scenarios. One is the U.S. fails to save Taiwan, and that has tremendous consequences for the Pacific, whether we actually enter the fight or not. There have been a number of simulations and war games that have shown really bad outcomes for the United States. These were done by Rand Corporation. Even the U.S. Marines has done its own simulation. I don't think they're very good simulations, but that's neither here nor there. I mean, it's not what I think, it's what the Pentagon thinks and what the decision makers in Washington think. And if they think the outcomes are going to be bad, then of course we're looking at some real concerns at the decision-making level, both in the Pentagon, the Defense Department, in the National Security Council, in the State Department, and of course at the level of the president. If they think we're going to lose, why get in it in the first place? There's also a concern that an attack by the Chinese might be paralleled with attacks elsewhere. Eastern Europe, where the Russians might get involved. Iran might use its missiles in the Middle East. One question is, would the Russians seek to humiliate NATO in the Balkans or in the Baltics or in Poland? Would Iran launch a missile attack on Israel? All these things compromise us to a certain extent because they involve us. In NATO, for sure, because we're committed by treaty to defend those countries and have to. And if we failed to do, NATO would collapse immediately. If we didn't defend Israel, there would be a huge outcry in the United States, political ramifications you can't even predict. So the danger that there could be a secondary crisis to go in parallel with the one on Taiwan can't be dismissed easily. It's there. And the Russians have been provocative, as you know, with aircraft flying around all the European capitals and flying in and out of the around Poland, flying around the United States. I mean, they're coming down our East Coast, coming down our West Coast, flying up around Alaska with Tupolev bombers. I mean, we see it all the time. So they're letting us know they're there and they're serious. If Taiwan falls, what happens to all the people on Taiwan? They're going to rush out of Taiwan and head for the United States as refugees. Can you imagine that kind of crisis? I went through the Vietnam one. In fact, I was a sponsor of 8 Vietnamese helicopter pilots, along with 3 of my colleagues. Brought them back to the U.S. These are the guys that flew the helicopters out, landed on U.S. ships. They were pushed the helicopters into the sea. And eventually made it to Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, where we retrieved them and essentially took over their lives in the United States until they could stand on their own feet. But that was a tiny number. But there were thousands of people that came, but nothing like what would happen if Taiwan fell. And then, of course, an even deeper and more serious question: will the U.S. become, as a result of all this challenge, increasingly isolationist? There are some people who think that President Trump's pull out in Iraq and Syria and wanting to pull out of Afghanistan, and which is a popular move, is popular because America is becoming isolationist, not just because those wars are lousy wars. So the issue arises, are we heading into an isolationist direction? And no one can say for sure, but it is something to think about. So what's the likely outcome? Number one is the U.S. will delay and seek a political solution if it's possible. I think that's the most likely outcome today at this very minute. But I think that has a half-life, an end game of its own, and whether we can get anywhere in terms of promoting a solution that anybody could accept, and whether a president could stay in office if a solution like that ended up in the default of Taiwan, the failure of Taiwan. That's a big question. Who lost Taiwan could be a battle cry, just like after 1950, who lost China was a battle cry for and elected a Republican president. I mean, people forget that Dwight Eisenhower became president not because he was a great general or a great politician. He was neither. But the fact is he became president because the Democrats were accused of losing China. Who lost China was a huge issue. And I think, of course, Eisenhower did other things that were great, like go to Korea and whatnot, ended that conflict, but as a compromise with 38th parallel. But I think we lose sight of the fact that who lost China was a huge issue in 1953 and helped Eisenhower win easily against Adlai Stevenson. So think about that. Would President Biden want to be responsible for losing Taiwan? It's easy for him to be pro-China, but is it easy for him to lose Taiwan? I think that it would create a huge political problem for the American Democratic Party. Another consequence is that any delay, the U.S. acting, could, for all intents and purposes, have the same effect that we talked about earlier, that Taiwan will end up losing its democracy and its independence. And then, of course, what's the fallout in Japan and the other Asian countries? And I think the last sentence that Korea will ask the U.S. troops to pull out and remove bases, the Japanese will do the same. The THAAD system will go away. These are just some of the outcomes that you can expect. So are there some strategies, and this is where I'm going to wind up, are there some ways to strengthen deterrence to make it too costly for China to take a risk of going after Taiwan and making it comfortable for the United States to avoid a war? Those are the kind of things we have to think about. And there are a couple of things, well, it's more than a couple, but quite a few things that can be brought up. But the first one, I mentioned earlier on when we started this discussion that the U.S. has provided F-16s to Taiwan in 1991. Under the Trump administration, there's been an agreement to sell Taiwan a new model of the F-16 called the F-16V, which is a much advanced aircraft from the earlier F-16s. And the earlier F-16s are also being upgraded. And the upgrade is a very significant upgrade. New electronics, new radar, AIAA radars, great improvements. But the point of the matter is that the F-16s, even the V, need conventional runways to take off and land. It's that simple. And they're not stealthy. So if the Chinese air defenses are as good as they advertised, they would be either targets in the air from Chinese missiles, or they would be targets on the ground from Chinese rockets. The F-35, especially the B model, doesn't need a long runway, either for takeoff or landing. And it's much more difficult to kill it. More than that, it's much more difficult to see it because the Chinese would be facing a fifth generation fighter with AMRAAM missiles and with some ability to launch air-to-ground missiles, smart weapons, easily much more advanced in terms of its communications platforms, its cooperative capabilities. It's kind of a flying AWACS along with being a flying fighter plane, fighter bomber. It would be a tremendous help to Taiwan, but the US government has refused to sell it to Taiwan. I think under current circumstances, we should dump the 16Bs and sell them F-35Bs now, right away, because it'll take some years to manufacture them and deploy them. So this would be my first recommendation, to build up deterrence rapidly, and even we could lend them some of ours for the intermediate period. Secondly, as we learned from Nagorno-Karabakh, UAVs and loitering munitions are really important, especially loitering munitions, in my opinion, like the Harop, the Israeli one, which was devastating to all the radar sets that were in use by the Armenians. That's because it's an anti-radiation system. And the Harop is rather stealthy. And it was very effective. Those things could really raise hell for China, and the US ought to sponsor it. The Harop is a descendant, a near descendant of another loitering munition called the Harpy. The Harpy was developed by the United States. So I think that this is an area where we could give a lot of help to Taiwan and a lot of problems for China that they haven't contemplated. And similarly, cruise missiles are something that now that the Taiwanese are building their own, but I can assure you ours are better. And we should be helping Taiwan with cruise missiles, fairly long range ones that can target Chinese missile fields. Again, the reason for these suggestions, and there are plenty of other ones, but these are just the ones that I have in mind, is to create deterrence, not to use them in a war. Because if the enemy knows you've got those things and has no answer for them, he's not going to likely use an aggressive tactic against you, because he's going to lose. And that was the whole original idea anyway of the US approach to Taiwan and giving it the deterrent capability. That's what Congress wanted. I want to remind you that Nixon Kissinger basically wrote Taiwan off, gone. But the US Congress didn't. And the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed in 1979, signed into law in 1979, was intended to balance that table and to give Taiwan support for its defense by the United States. That was its main purpose. That's what it was there for. And there's been some subsequent acts in the past, but for a very long time, and I mean a very long time, Taiwan was isolated. There was no communications between Taiwan's military and the US military. It was very limited through the back door, if at all. There was no hotline or no command and control shared, no radar system shared, no training shared. Now, some of that has changed, and especially in the last administration. But it needs to change even more, because it's vital that we link up as tightly as we can if we're going to provide sufficient deterrence to China. There are some other ideas I have, and I have them under political military below, that could be helpful. I don't need to spend a lot of time on them, but I think perhaps the the most important one is for the U.S. to get a base on one of the Taiwanese claimed islands. Could be done by leasing the island to the United States. As simple as that. Chinese would go nuts, of course, but again, it would show the Chinese that the U.S. that if they're going to attack Taiwan, they're going to attack the U.S. And that, that after all, is exactly the message that they should get. And then another alternative to that is building a fortress in the Senkaku Islands, which come down from Japan and come within about 110 kilometers, roughly 60 some miles from Taiwan itself and from the most strategic part of Taiwan. These are Japanese islands. Japan has just started to fortify them a little bit, very hesitantly. Up to now, they weren't fortified at all, but that's a major sea lane out from the first island chain. If you block it, the Chinese don't come out. So they're doing some initial work there. They should be doing it with us. We should be working with Japan to build up and fortify those islands so they can close down the sea lanes that the Chinese might like to have open, if necessary. If not necessary, no reason to do it. And then just the last point I wanted to mention is the median line in the Taiwan Straits. Since 1955, the median line in the Taiwan Straits has been an understanding where Chinese military aircraft can go and where they can't go, and where Taiwanese military aircraft can go and where they can't go. China has been systematically violating the median line, especially in the last few months, and running sorties around, these are fighter planes around Taiwan, and they don't give a damn about the median line. No one has said anything to the Chinese about this. The US has been quiet, at least in public, it's been quiet. It's time to tell the Chinese to cut it out. If they cross the median line, they're going to find US airplanes. They're not just Taiwanese airplanes. I mean, these are kind of the political military things we should be thinking about to try and put pressure back on the Chinese rather than have it just in one direction. So can we avoid a war in Taiwan? To a large extent, it's not up to us, of course, it's up to China. If China decides to go to war, they go to war. But what we can do is balance the table, put pressure back on China, create deterrence again. And by creating deterrence again, hopefully the Chinese will get the message and decide that the time has not come for them to try and attack Taiwan, and that they can be contained. There was George Kennan in 1950 that talked about containing Russia, very important cable he sent from Moscow to Washington, and later when he served on the policy planning staff at the State Department. Containment was essentially the US policy toward the Soviet Union until finally the Soviet Union disintegrated. I don't know what will happen in China, but I think we have to practice containment. We can't just let China have the whole show to itself, because the strategic and the human consequences of that are far too great. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that's of some use to you, and I'm certainly willing to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, this is fantastic, really amazing. Very, very in-depth analysis of the regional area with that of insightful information. Folks, if you have any questions, you're welcome to type in Q&A or
let me see how I can. Let me just.
Yeah, or raise hand to be unmuted. So before that, you mentioned about this defense of the island, but recently, as you know, that there's some kind of patrolling ADIZ over this Pratas Island, the island in the South China Sea, the Pratas. And
Yes.
I think there was some concern. They just isolate island and won't let the Taiwan supply to the island, and they will maybe try to force some kind of infringement. So how do you think about those kind of scenarios? Should Taiwan put a stand, or United States should put a stand there, or you should let that drag into the kind of conflict, or you should
Those
not
are
put?
far away. I mean,
Yeah,
those are far away from Taiwan. They're not strategic for Taiwan, and they're not even strategic for the United States. Uh, so I'm not sure you waste your money on that one. Uh, Now, the South China Sea islands, and they're not only islands, they're reefs, and some of them are artificial, uh, have multiple claimants, uh, and not just China. And in fact, the Chinese claim was the weakest of the bunch. I don't know if you know, but the various uh, countries in the area took this matter, including China, who agreed to it, took this matter to the World Court for arbitration. And the World Court said China doesn't own these islands. Absolutely, not theirs. So China occupied them anyway. So, okay, World Court can do it at once. We're going to take these reefs and islands, and that's where they've built up these. They have militarized some of them. They've put missiles there. They put airstrips there. They put command centers there. They put radars, basically to control the South China Sea passageway, sea lines of communication up through past Taiwan, Japan, Korea. Which is why the U.S. keeps running demonstration through those islands, and angers the Chinese. As you know, the Chinese get very upset when we send a couple of our missile boats through, or an aircraft carrier, mostly missile boats, sometimes even less than that, but mostly just to let the Chinese know that we're freedom of navigation is something we're going to insist on. And the that has seemed to work to some extent anyway. And we've also done the same through the Taiwan Straits. We've sent U.S. aircraft carriers and surface ships through the straits, probably submarines, but we don't talk about that. I'm sure the Chinese know.
yeah. And by the way, you mentioned the F-35B,
Yes,
the vertical taking off landing, the ones, and in your recent article, you were talking about lease to
that's right.
Taiwan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to persuade the administration uh, to do it without having to look for the money to do it with, and without the Taiwanese having to look for the money, or that much money to do it with. Something quick. A lease would be quick. I mean, I was thinking actually about uh, World War II and what the U.S. did. We weren't in the war yet. If you remember, 1939, we didn't get into the war until 1941 when the Japanese attacked Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. Uh, but, Roosevelt administration was trying to find ways to help the British survive. One of the systems was lend-lease. We would lend ships and aircraft and other things to the UK, and later we extended it to the Russians too. We would send lend-lease to them as a way of making sure they could survive. That was a very important model, and it has been proved itself. It was I don't think Britain would have made it without that kind of help, because Britain would have felt that they couldn't, despite Churchill's wonderful speeches, that I think the British leadership was very close to capitulating to Hitler, because they didn't see an alternative. France had fallen. Italy was on the Axis side, not on our side. Belgium had fallen. Holland had fallen. Russia looked like it was going to collapse. The invasion of Russia was far advanced. Kiev had gone. Stalingrad was being challenged. They were on the outskirts of Moscow. Leningrad was isolated. I mean, it was a very bad scene. And I think, well, America was very isolationist at the time. The Roosevelt administration wanted to try and save Britain. And so that was their, it's what they did. And it really helped. It was very important. And it also got our defense industry moving, which had been, before World War II. It wasn't much defense industry other than a decision, and I think it was in 1939, to expand the Navy, which turned out to be very prescient because, well, Pearl Harbor wasn't as much of a Japanese success as the Japanese would like us to believe. It did a lot of damage to our fleet. It didn't get our aircraft carriers because they weren't important at the time. But all the rest suffered a great deal. But the buildup of our Navy had already gone 2 years, and it was remarkably fast. And that was a big factor. So these ideas have always been in my head. And I thought, well, why don't we do it again? Let's save Taiwan. That was the idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. But did you see the Q&A box and Bob and John?
Let me take a look. I haven't looked at it yet.
Yeah.
The first one is Bob. Do you believe that China's actions, as you outline, are part of China's 100-year marathon? Well, my good friend thinks that's exactly what it is, that it's part of China's 100-year marathon. Look, China is a big, big country, a very ambitious country. And it's ambitious about its neighborhood for sure. So it wants to dominate its neighborhood. If it's going to do that, I believe it's fully, the Chinese fully believe that the only way it can dominate its neighborhood is to force the United States out of its neighborhood. Full stop. The US is the great counterweight. So I think what the Chinese are looking for is to find ways to push us out by new kinds of weapons that make us stay back further from China and from the Chinese space, naval and air. That's one. By intimidating the littoral countries around China, Japan, Korea, Philippines, all the others, Vietnam, by Singapore, Malaysia, intimidating them all and making them understand that if they cooperate with the United States, they're not a friend of China. So yeah, the answer to Bob's question is, you're right. Second Bob question. AA6TB is, I see, that's not a question. There's two people. I see. I'm sorry, I missed it. So to Jan and Bob, I'm answering.
Yeah, they actually our AIAA officer in Orange County, next to Los Angeles. They're doing
the
this.
One last great Republican holdout in California.
Yeah, that's the area. Yeah, they're right there.
Actually elected I saw another congressman, a Republican congressman, in some kind of recount today got in. I think that was in Orange County or near it. So that's good news. I'm a Republican. Didn't you notice?
Oh, there's another question from Aaron coming up. Did you see it?
That's a tricky question, Aaron. A very smart question, but a very tricky one. Let's start with Kinmen. Okay, Matsu is a pile of rocks, but Kinmen is there's a population there. It's a very pleasant. By the way, it's a very beautiful and pleasant island. But there's a serious population there. There's military installations there. If Taiwan abandoned that, it would be seen as a massive defeat for Taiwan. I think it would set into motion a devolution of Taiwan politically that could very well end up with the collapse of Taiwan, or at least its decision to make a deal with the Chinese, which would be a very negative deal. So it's not just a tripwire, but in fact, it's politically critical. The other one I was thinking about was Penghu, where Taiwan has a major airbase, important airbase. Same story, I think. Uh, China could attack either one of them. Kinmen is so close to China that it's the easiest pickings if you want to get into a war. Now, you could ask another question, which is a more interesting one, is what would the United States do if China attacked Kinmen and not Taiwan? Would we still help Taiwan defend it? It's very hard to defend, by the way. It's not simple. And what will we do with all the refugees? I mean, there's a lot of those sort of things that I never thought of Kinmen as a tripwire. I always thought of it as an asset, but a risky one because of its location. Again, whether it's Kinmen or Penghu, both of them would be terribly damaging to Taiwan politically and militarily. More politically than militarily, because Kinmen is not so interesting from a military point of view. It's really, whereas Penghu has an important airfield and does have some military significance. I hope that answers your question. It's a great question.
Actually, you mentioned about the presidential debate between President Kennedy and President Nixon. I think this was touched. And according to...
It was a big part of the debate. It was the most controversial
very controversial
issue.
According to President Kennedy, he was saying that President Eisenhower actually sent a diplomat to persuade Chiang Kai-shek to withdraw from Kinmen and Matsu. Chiang Kai-shek refused. So
Right.
so that's I think the treaty at that time was United was forced to defend. Of course Nixon was saying it's not good to abandon the ally, those things. But I think it's a lingering situation. But you are right. It will be
well, yeah. I mean, and remember that was when, first of all, the U.S. had diplomatic relations with Taiwan, with Republic of China, which was still called that, by the way, which is Taiwan. So we had diplomatic relations. We had more than that. We had bases there, and we had American soldiers and Marines, especially there. And Chiang Kai-shek, as it's called, was our guy, right? And I'm sure they tried to convince him to. This is 1949. You can't defend that. Don't stay there. But he stayed there and he won. So he was smarter than the Americans at the time. It's a very interesting, I mean, that's an interesting thing. I would love to be able to read what the Chinese thought about all that, because they backed out. They got 3 days of war. They didn't do well. They got out. Incidentally, and it should be mentioned, nobody knows how China's military would really operate in the real world today. They haven't been in a war since the Korean War, in real sense. Yeah, they played around in Vietnam during the Vietnam conflict, but they weren't front and center. But basically, they have not fought any real war. They don't have an officer cadre that has ever fought a war. Whoever did in 1950 are long gone, under the soil or in a box somewhere in some temple in China. But they're all gone. So they're inexperienced. They have no practical operational way to test what they do. The U.S. has been in wars constantly for the second half of the 20th century and the first 20 years of the 21st century. So 70 years of, and if you don't add, you could add in another 10 years because of the Second World War. So, 80 years of constant conflict, which means our officer corps is very smart. They've got lots of combat experience. They have lots of experience with communications, with command, with the coordination. And nowadays, with the modern types of weapons, with the precision guided weapons and all that, satellites, and I mean, this is all part of our experience. That's why we're the best at it. I think the best at it in the world today. Maybe the Israelis are pretty good, but not on a global basis. The U.S. is best at it in the world. The Russians don't even come near, and they know it. So Chinese want to take that on. I understand that the Mattis, General Mattis, the secretary, when he was SecDef, told his Chinese counterpart, "Sure you want to get into a fight with us?" And they were having beers after the formal meeting. "You sure you want to get into that mess? You're going to lose. It may take us longer than we would like, but we're going to lose for sure because you don't have the slightest idea how to go about this. You're going to get creamed." And he told him to his face. I like Mattis. He's a real soldier. He may not be a great Secretary of Defense, but he's a real soldier. That's an interesting question. This is from Aaron again about do I see much likelihood of strategic relationship growing between the U.S. and Vietnam as an aspect of Chinese containment in the future? They see it that way. The Vietnamese do. And they've been very cordial to the United States. It's funny how geopolitics trumps ideology because, it's a communist country. I was in Vietnam in 74 and 75, but, on the other side. But yeah, I mean, their interest is to not be threatened by China any more than anybody else wants to be threatened by China. But they have some firsthand experience. Remember about Cambodia and about the Vietnamese intervening to keep the Chinese out. They know what they want to do. So I think the answer is absolutely right, for sure.
Dr. Bryen, you mentioned about this Patriot system in Taiwan, and it's not really designed for up to date. So how do you think Taiwan should? Of course, I think there's some difference, but how do you think Taiwan get the Iron Dome from Israel or the South?
Well, Iron Dome is a system it's optimized for very small rockets and cruise missiles. So it's not a solution they need. I'm not going to say yes or no, but the U.S. has THAAD, and we have the ground-based interceptor, and we have Aegis onshore. Aegis onshore is a real option. THAAD, I think, is a strategic system. It's not really optimized for what Taiwan faces. Okay, it's supposed to be exo-atmospheric. We have put it in Korea, ostensibly to go after Korean ICBMs aimed at the U.S. I think it's really aimed at China, but that's my opinion. I think the Chinese think it's aimed at China. They made that very clear. But so THAAD is not really the right system. Aegis is probably a very good system for Taiwan, but we haven't offered it to them. Aegis onshore. It would help them a great deal because I don't think today that Patriot, I would call it plain Patriot, including PAC-3 Patriot, is good enough to knock out modern missiles where the warhead separates from the rocket, because the radar can't discriminate enough to go after the warhead and not the rocket. That seems to be the problem that's been seen in Saudi Arabia when the Houthis fired rockets. The other problem is it's no good against cruise missiles, as you probably saw when the Iranians launched cruise missiles against Saudi oil fields, and PAC-3 didn't respond because it didn't see them. So they have a problem with cruise missiles in Taiwan for sure to defend against those. That I think Patriot could be improved for, or some version of Iron Dome that was optimized for longer range would make sense. When it comes to dealing with more strategic type missile threats against Taiwanese airfields and whatnot, then I think you are talking about something like Aegis on shore, which if it's properly positioned, a few of those units could really do a lot to protect Taiwan. And I don't understand why it hasn't been offered to Taiwan. Should have been. I'm going to put that on my list now that you talked about it. It reminded me of this question. I'm going to put it on my list of to-dos because this would be very helpful for Taiwan.
You're right, absolutely. You're right. Yeah, they're really good.
By the way, we could also put it on Okinawa.
That's right, Okinawa too. And that's actually related to my next question. You know, there's a small, tiny island, this east tip of Japan, is Yonaguni.
That's at the end of the Ryukyu chain. Chain. Yeah, it's the last one.
Yeah. And I heard that the news saying that there's some kind of a squadron or something, the Apache AH-64 stationed there. And I don't know whether it's the Japanese or the Taiwanese has access, but it's a Japanese territory.
No, it's a Japanese island.
Yeah, but you mentioned about the concern.
I don't think there's anything stationed there.
There's no station there?
But I don't know.
I
mean, maybe they are, but what Apache is not, it's not exactly the thing you want to have there. You want to have, I would like to see long-range naval guns there.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because the naval gun is still a great weapon if it has long range, and if you have a PGM warhead instead of the dumb warhead. And while the U.S. Navy has had trouble coming up with a good PGM, the Italians have a very, I used to work, president of Finmeccanica North America, which is now Leonardo. We have a great solution for a 155 ammunition. This gives you many, many miles and absolute accuracy and multiple, hitting multiple targets at the same time. All that is available. The U.S. has been very sleepy about defense. Good on aircraft. I think we've done a great job on aircraft, although I think we need at least something more than the F-35. We need essentially an F-15EX, but maybe an F-15XX that's made stealthy because it can carry a big load and it's a real threat and has long range. So that's something we need. So we've been all right on there. Naval-wise, we're 25 years old because we haven't been modernizing nearly as fast as we should be. And a lot of naval systems really need upgrades, but some of them are good. I mean, Aegis being, of course, very good, but we need to work on that. Air defenses, rotten. I mean, we've been completely behind the Russians and the Chinese and the Israelis. I mean, how could that happen? How could that happen? What an embarrassment that we're so far behind the other guys. And this is, if you want to look at Nagorno-Karabakh and what just happened there, those drones knocked out a whole bunch of Armenian air defenses.
Yeah.
So it could happen to us. We have to have air defenses that really can work against modern threats, and we don't have it right now.
But when you talk about drone, recently the Congress approved the MQ-9 armed self to Taiwan. Do you refer to that kind of drone, or is it a different kind?
MQ-9 is, if that's the one you're thinking of, I think that's the reconnaissance drone. It's not an armed drone.
Oh, okay. I see.
I'm thinking of drones that shoot.
I see. In your article, like
Reaper,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Or there's now going to be a successor to that, Reaper. But the problem with the drone. Let me just. Can I take a minute to talk about it?
Sure, of course.
The problem that we've now seen from Nagorno-Karabakh has shown us that man-in-the-loop drones can be knocked out. The Russians have a system that worked pretty well and was able to knock out some of the Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones because they have communications and GPS. Communications back to a command center and GPS for guidance and, to the target. So you can jam GPS and you can jam communications. And that's what the Russians finally did. They were late to the game getting it there, but they were able to do it. So the point I want to make is that in the future, we're going to have drones that are autonomous or semi-autonomous, or that have ironclad, non-interferable communications. These are big challenges, but it has to be done. And that's going to be the future, because the Chinese are doing the same thing. The Russians, they're building jammers, and they know what they're doing. But they're also building lots of drones, which I think are second-rate drones if you have your own jammers. By the way, the U.S. is behind on jammers. Same story. Why aren't we doing that? Okay. I don't want to preach. I don't work in the Pentagon. I don't work in the aerospace industry anymore, except notionally here and there. So, but I think these are things that there are opportunities, but there are also deficits. We have to fill the voids. And if we fill them, we're going to be a much stronger country.
Yeah, I think just because you mentioned about building, I think recently there's a news like Northrop Grumman or somebody that come up with some kind of uh, sixth generation, fighter, those kind of uh, plan or something like that. But coming back to this, and you mentioned about the needs of F-35B, but as you know that I think the production has been lined up for years because we have allies, they purchased F-35B. So when you're talking about the lease, F-35B to Taiwan, and where would the aircraft come from? It's from
Lend some of ours to them.
something already built.
Yeah. Then we backfill ours.
I see.
They're the ones that are facing the threat.
Understood.
Yeah.
So not from Japan, but mostly from us, from here.
Japan doesn't have. Well, you mean the American ones in Japan? I don't know how many there are right now. So I'm smoking some kind of bad drugs here. So I don't want to commit to that. But I think there are different ways to fill the gap. But one way is to lend them some of our Bs. They don't need so many. They just need a pipeline and be trained on them, and so they can begin to deploy them, so that the Chinese have something to really worry about. I mean, then you can fill the pot, with more. And you can also reprogram how many, Lockheed's making a lot of. We don't need 1,700 F-35As, for our services right now, or however 2,000 or however they're going to build. We need a few hundred of these Bs in the right place. Right? It's a tactic. You have to think strategically. The programmatic kind of thinking kills you, because you end up buying what you don't need and not buying what you do need. You have to meet the emergency. I think Taiwan is a kind of an emergency, because if it gets out of hand, it will fall, and we'll lose our posture in the Pacific, and it will be a terrible, dreadful thing for us too, not just Taiwan. So that's how I believe, that we have to move. I mean, and I'll be honest with you, I don't see enough strategic thinking anywhere in our government, and I don't care which administration it is, it really doesn't matter. I think that you get a very flat, uncreative, unimaginative approach to tactics and strategy, which is not what you want. You want to respond to threats, not just say, well, in 20 years, if we have this, we'll be that much stronger. Great. In 20 years, I'll be pushing up daisies in some cemetery. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in preventing war now. And if you want to prevent conflict and war now, you have to use your assets creatively. That's what strategy is all about. That's what I do. That's all I'm good for, is strategy. But that's what I believe. And so at least that's what I think we should be doing. That's how I would argue it today.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what you were saying is really the best strategy, to avoid those potential war, to prevent them. One thing is I've been thinking, in Taiwan there's a very powerful radar system called PULSE, the PULSE radar
Up on the
system.
mountain.
Yeah, but obviously that will be the first target for the Chinese to strike. So if it's, I know there's the Patriot PAC-3 defending it, but just by chance, if it somehow got damage, is there any alternative as a backup, in case
Yeah,
that
there
happens?
is in Japan.
Oh, I see, I see, I see. Yeah,
And
because you need to know.
well,
That's very
this is
important.
another issue. I mean, look, I think since I have to say something. I don't know for sure, okay, but I'm willing to bet that the U.S. takes advantage of the Taiwanese radar, okay, because eyes and ears. Okay, you need eyes and ears. Everybody does. So, assuming that's true, the U.S. would have to reciprocate somehow, right? So their eyes, or our eyes, and their eyes have to exchange information. So I think that that's a very important. That's also why we put the big radar in Korea for TAD. It looks right into China's soft underbelly, which is right where we want it to look. And then the Chinese have complained bitterly about it because they know very well what it's doing. But are they going to attack Korea? Are they going to attack the United States and Korea? I don't think so.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think that some news said that's why they were mad when the SAR system was deployed in South Korea, because also equipped with a very powerful radar system. That was from the news. Yeah, from the
Yeah,
news.
correct. I only work on what's from the news. I mean, uh, I left the government in 1988, so anything I learned in 1988 is hardly useful now. But you have to. Strategy is something that is discernment more than anything else. If you know the facts as much as you can know them, and then you figure out what your requirements and needs are, and what the risks and dangers are, then you can come up with a formula of some sort that will see you through. And sometimes you get it wrong. I mean, there's no guarantee you get everything right. I wish there was, but you have to give it your best shot. And you can't just use this flat model that the U.S. government is using today. And I mean the Pentagon, but not only the White House, this NSC, the CIA, they all have this flat model. Uh, it's okay, but it doesn't solve your problem. Your problem is not 20 years from now. Your problem's now and tomorrow and the day after. And that's what you have to do. I hope that's good. I think it's time for me to go watch football.